How much is your honesty worth when no one is watching? The words didn't come from anger or arrogance, they came calmly, almost gently, as 10 crisp $1,000 bills slid across the polished walnut table, their edges perfectly aligned like they had been measured with a ruler. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence, while floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline that most people only saw in postcards. Clara Bennett stood at the far end of the room, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, not gripping, not trembling, just there, like she was reminding herself she still existed in a place that didn't feel like hers. The conference room smelled faintly of expensive leather and fresh coffee, the kind she never had time to sit down and enjoy at home. Her eyes flickered briefly to the money, then away, as if staring too long might make it real, might make it harder to refuse. Alexander Hayes didn't lean forward, didn't raise his voice. He simply watched her with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his entire life being right about people. His tailored suit sat perfectly against his frame, his expression unreadable but not cold, not yet just curious, as if Clara was a variable in a system he already understood. Just one sentence, he added, his tone even measured, like he was offering directions rather than temptation. You confirm the numbers we discussed and you walk out with $10,000 today. No contracts, no complications. Around the table executives shifted subtly, some pretending to check their tablets, others watching her openly with a kind of detached interest, like they had seen this moment play out before and already knew the ending. Clara inhaled slowly, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to steady something inside her chest. Her fingers brushed the surface of the table, tracing an invisible line where the wood met the air. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in, the expectation, the judgment, the quiet assumption that everyone had a price somewhere behind her eyes. A different room flickered into existence, smaller, dimmer, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting shadows across peeling paint. Her daughter curled beneath a thin blanket, a faint cough breaking the silence, the kind that lingered, the kind that made nights feel longer than they should be. Clara's jaw tightened just slightly, the memory not loud, not dramatic, just present, like a truth she carried everywhere. Alexander noticed the shift, not in her posture but in the pause that followed it. He had seen hesitation before it usually came with darting eyes, quick calculations, subtle tells that people thought they were hiding. But Clara didn't look at the money again, she didn't look at anyone, she simply stood there as if the decision had already been made, somewhere far deeper than the surface level where fear and need lived. The clock on the wall ticked once, then again, louder now, or maybe it just felt that way because no one else was speaking. The city outside continued moving, cars gliding through intersections, people chasing schedules, unaware that inside this room a single sentence was waiting to be bought. Clara exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering, not in defeat but in something closer to acceptance, not of the offer but of herself. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, not weak, not uncertain, just quiet enough that the room had to listen. "I'm sorry," she said, and for a moment it sounded like she might be apologizing for more than just the answer, like she was acknowledging the distance between where she stood and what was being asked of her. She lifted her eyes, meeting Alexander's for the first time fully, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something steadier, something that didn't bend. "I can't." The words didn't echo, they didn't need to, they settled into the room with a weight that no amount of money could match, and for the first time since the meeting began, the certainty in Alexander Hayes's gaze shifted just slightly, as if something he thought he understood had quietly rewritten itself right in front of him. No one spoke after she said it, not because they did not understand but because they did, and that made it heavier, the kind of silence that did not feel empty but full, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Clara Bennett did not move, her hands were still resting lightly against the edge of the table, as if she had anchored herself there and refused to drift even a fraction. The $10,000 remained untouched between her and Alexander Hayes, its presence louder now than before because it had just been rejected. One of the executives cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, the faint scrape of leather against polished wood sounding almost inappropriate in the stillness. Someone else let out a quiet exhale, a hint of disbelief slipping through before they caught themselves, but no one laughed, no one spoke, not yet. Alexander's gaze did not leave Clara, he studied her, not like a man offended or challenged, but like someone trying to understand a language he had heard but never needed to speak before. His fingers tapped once against the table, not impatient, just thoughtful, as if recalibrating something invisible in his mind. "You cannot," he repeated slowly, not as a question but as a confirmation. Clara nodded once, small, controlled her voice when it came again, steady in a way that did not invite argument. "No sir, I cannot." The word sir was not submissive, it was respectful but distant, like she was drawing a line that no amount of money could cross someone at. The far end of the table leaned forward, unable to contain himself. "It is a simple adjustment," he said, trying to sound reasonable, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Everyone here understands how these deals work. You would not be hurting anyone." Clara turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. Not anger, not defiance, something quieter, something harder to bend. "Maybe not today," she said softly, "but I would know." That was all she added. No speech, no explanation, just that one sentence, and somehow it carried more weight than anything else said in the room. Alexander's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, not in frustration but in recognition. He had heard variations of negotiation tactics for years, watched people justify numbers, decisions, entire careers built on small compromises that stacked neatly into something no one questioned anymore. But this was different. This was not strategy, it was refusal, without performance, without anger, without the need to prove anything, and that unsettled him more than if she had argued. He leaned back slightly, his chair barely making a sound as the city stretched behind him. Through the glass walls, sunlight catching along the edges of buildings, casting reflections that shifted as clouds moved overhead. "Do you know what happens to deals like this when someone refuses to cooperate?" Another voice cut in, sharper this time, colder. Clara did not look at the speaker. She kept her eyes on Alexander, as if he was the only one whose reaction mattered. "I imagine they find someone else," she replied. The honesty of it landed clean. No bitterness, no plea, just fact. A few people exchanged glances. One of them shook his head faintly, as if dismissing her, already calculating how quickly she would be replaced, how easily the system would continue without her. And maybe they were right. Maybe she would walk out of this room and nothing would change for them. But something had already shifted for Alexander. He felt it in the space between words, in the way the room no longer moved the way it had before, like a machine that had briefly lost its rhythm. He reached forward at last, not for the money but for the document lying beside it, flipping it closed with a quiet, decisive motion that drew every eye back to him. "That will be all for now," he said, his tone calm but final. Chairs creaked softly as people hesitated, unsure whether the meeting was truly ending or simply pausing. No one moved until he added without raising his voice, "I said we are done this time." They stood one by one, gathering tablets, folders, murmuring to each other in low voices. Confusion threaded through their professionalism as they filed out, leaving the room emptier but somehow heavier than before. Clara remained where she was, unsure if she had been dismissed or if she was supposed to follow the others. She shifted her weight slightly, her fingers finally lifting from the table, leaving behind the faintest impression against the polished surface. Alexander did not look at her immediately. He waited until the door clicked shut behind the last executive, until the silence returned, but this time it felt different, less oppressive, more focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before but clearer. "Clara Bennett," he said her name as if testing it. "How long have you been here?" She blinked once, caught off guard by the question. 3 weeks, sir. Temporary contract," she answered. He nodded, slowly absorbing that information as if it mattered more than it should. Then he looked at the untouched money still resting between them, and for the first time there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not curiosity, not calculation, something closer to respect, though he did not name it. "You just turned down more than most people in this building would make in a month," he said, not as a challenge but as a statement. Clara followed his gaze briefly to the money, then back to him, her voice unchanged. "Then I guess it was not mine to take." And for a moment neither of them spoke again, but the silence no longer felt like pressure, it felt like the beginning of something neither of them had planned but neither of them could ignore anymore. The room felt larger after everyone left, not because the walls had moved but because the noise was gone, and what remained was something sharper, something harder to ignore. Clara shifted her weight again, the quiet pressing gently against her ears as if asking her to say something to fill it, but she did not. She had learned a long time ago that silence was not always emptiness, sometimes it was protection. Alexander Hayes walked around the table slowly, not pacing, not restless, just deliberate, each step measured, like he was approaching a conclusion he had not expected to reach. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that the distance between them felt intentional rather than accidental. "Most people would have taken it," he said, not looking at her at first, his gaze drifting briefly toward the skyline beyond the glass. "Some would have negotiated for more." Clara let out a faint breath, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. "Most people probably need it just as much as I do," she replied. Her honesty did not sound defensive, it sounded factual, like she was stating the weather outside. Alexander turned his head, then studying her again more carefully, this time noticing the small things he had overlooked before, the slight wear at the edge of her sleeve, the way her shoes were polished but old, the quiet exhaustion that sat behind her eyes without asking for attention. "And yet you did not," he said. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I have to go home tonight and explain my day to someone who believes everything I say." She answered simply, there was no hesitation in her voice, no performance, just truth, and something in that answer landed deeper than he expected. Alexander felt a memory brush against the edge of his thoughts, uninvited and unwelcome. A much smaller room years ago, a different kind of silence, one where explanations had never quite lined up with what he had seen. He blinked once, pushing it away, but the echo remained faint but persistent. You have a child, he said more quietly. Clara nodded. Once a daughter, she added, her voice softening in a way it had not before, not weaker, just warmer, like the word itself carried weight. She is 6. Alexander absorbed that information, his expression unreadable, but something behind it shifting into place, pieces connecting without him fully understanding. Why does she know what you do here? He asked. Clara's lips curved slightly, not into a smile but into something gentler. She thinks I work in a very tall building and help people make important decisions, she said. I try to make sure that is still true when I come home. The words settled between them, and for a moment Alexander said nothing. He looked at her differently now, not as a temporary employee, not as a variable in a test, but as someone who had drawn a line and refused to move it, even when it would have been easy, even when it would have made sense on paper. He reached toward the table again, this time picking up the envelope of cash, holding it for a second before placing it back down, not pushing it toward her, not offering it again, just acknowledging its existence. Do you know why I asked you to do that? He said. Clara shook her head slowly. No, sir. He exhaled quietly, his shoulders easing a fraction. Because everyone else already did, he said. The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Clara's eyes flickered slightly, the first visible reaction she had shown since the conversation began. Not shock, not judgment, just recognition of what that meant. Alexander continued, his voice steady but lower now, as if the room itself required a different tone, different departments, different meetings. Same question, adjusted slightly each time, but the answer was always the same. They justified it, they explained it, they made it sound necessary. He paused, his gaze returning to her fully. You did not? Clara did not respond right away. She let the silence sit, letting his words settle before answering. Maybe they had reasons, she said finally, not defending them, not condemning them, just acknowledging the complexity. People usually do. Alexander studied her for a long moment, then nodded once slowly, as if that answer mattered as much as the first. And you? He asked. What is your reason? Clara's fingers brushed lightly against the table again, grounding herself the same way she had before, but this time there was no tension in the movement. Because some things do not belong to circumstances, she said quietly, they belong to you. The simplicity of it left no space for argument, and for the first time in a long time Alexander Hayes found himself without a response, not because he disagreed but because he could not remember the last time someone had said something that did not bend under pressure. The city outside continued moving, unaware that inside a glass room high above the streets something invisible had shifted, not a deal, not a number, something quieter, something that could not be written into a contract but could change the way one was made. The quiet did not break, it shifted, settling into something steadier, something that felt less like pressure and more like clarity. Clara could feel it in the way the air no longer pressed against her chest, in the way her shoulders eased without her realizing it. Alexander Hayes remained where he was, his gaze no longer measuring, no longer calculating, but observing. In a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself, as if he were seeing not just her answer but the weight behind it. He turned slightly, glancing at the city again, the late afternoon light softening the sharp edges of the buildings, casting long reflections across the glass before looking back at her. You understand what this place runs on, he said, his tone even but quieter than before. Clara followed his glance briefly, then returned her eyes to him. Decisions, she answered after a moment, and the consequences that follow them. Alexander nodded, once the corner of his mouth tightening, not into a smile but into something acknowledging. Most people would say numbers, he replied, or strategy, or timing. Clara gave a faint shake of her head. Those are tools, not reasons, she said. The simplicity of her words landed again, clean, unembellished, and difficult to dismiss. Alexander let out a slow breath, not frustration, not disagreement, something closer to recognition. He walked back toward the head of the table, this time not to reclaim authority but to reframe it. His fingers rested lightly against the back of the chair where he had been sitting earlier. Do you know why I built this company? He asked. The question seemed to arrive from nowhere, but it did not feel random. Clara hesitated only briefly before answering. To succeed, she said. Honestly, Alexander let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh, but without humor. That is what everyone says, he replied. It is the version that fits into headlines and investor calls. He paused, his eyes drifting slightly as if following a memory he had not intended to revisit. I built it because I was tired of watching people pretend that cutting corners was the only way forward, he continued, his voice lower, now more personal than anything he had allowed in that room before. And somewhere along the way I stopped noticing when it started happening here anyway. The admission hung between them, unexpected and unpolished. Clara did not interrupt, she did not offer reassurance, she simply listened the way someone does when they understand that what is being said is not meant to be fixed but acknowledged. Alexander looked back at her then, his expression steadier but no longer distant. "You said some things belong to you," he said, "not to circumstances." Clara nodded once yes. He considered that for a moment, then reached for the document again, opening it slowly, flipping through the pages, not scanning, not reviewing, just holding them as if deciding what they meant now compared to a few minutes ago. "If that is true," he said, "then so do the decisions we allow." Clara's eyes moved briefly to the document, then back to him. "Yes, sir," she answered simply. Alexander closed the file again, more deliberately this time, and placed it aside, not in the center of the table where it had dominated the conversation before, but off to the side where it no longer commanded attention. The shift was small but unmistakable. He stepped away from the chair again, stopping closer to her than before, not imposing, not distant, just present. "Your contract," he said, "it is temporary." Clara nodded. "Yes, sir, 3 months." He studied her for a moment longer, then spoke with the same calm tone he had used at the beginning of the meeting, but now it carried something different, not authority alone but intention. "It will not be temporary anymore." Clara blinked once, the words taking a second to settle. "I am sorry," she said softly, unsure if she had heard correctly. "I did not ask for that." Alexander shook his head. "Once I know," he replied, "that is why it matters." The room seemed to shift again, not physically but in the space between them where something unspoken had just been acknowledged. Clara straightened slightly, not out of tension but out of instinct, the kind that comes when life moves in a direction you did not plan for. "What would you expect from me?" she asked, her voice steady but careful. Alexander met her gaze fully this time, no distance, no calculation, just clarity. "The same thing you gave me today," he said, "an answer that does not change depending on who is asking." The words settled into her not as pressure but as recognition. Clara exhaled softly, her fingers no longer gripping the edge of the table, no longer needing to anchor herself because something had already shifted beneath her feet in a way that felt uncertain but not unstable. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting the room in a warmer light, and for the first time since she walked in, Clara Bennett felt like she was no longer standing at the edge of something she did not belong to but at the beginning of something she had unknowingly already changed. Clara did not leave immediately, even after the words had been said, even after the decision had been made. There was a quiet pause that followed, not awkward, not uncertain, but necessary, like both of them understood that something had shifted and rushing away from it would make it feel smaller than it actually was. Alexander Hayes stepped back slightly, giving her space without dismissing her. His posture relaxed in a way that did not match the man who had walked into the meeting earlier, the one who had controlled every outcome before it even began. "Human resources will update your contract by tomorrow morning," he said, his tone returning to professional but not distant. Clara nodded once, absorbing the information, her mind already moving ahead, not to the title, not to the change, but to what it would mean at home, to rent, to groceries, to a 6-year-old girl who still believed her mother worked in a place where important decisions were made. "Thank you," she said simply, the words not exaggerated, not emotional, just honest. Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. "You should go home," he added after a moment. "It has been a long day." Clara hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because she disagreed but because leaving now felt different than when she had first walked in. Back then she had been hoping to keep a job, now she was walking out with something she had not expected and had not asked for. She gave a small nod and turned toward the door, her step steady, not rushed, her hand reaching for the handle just as the light in the room shifted again, the sun dipping lower, casting a golden reflection across the floor. She paused briefly, not turning back but aware of the moment in a way she could not fully explain. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The noise returned immediately, voices, footsteps, the distant ringing of phones, the building alive again as if nothing inside that room had changed. Clara walked past glass offices and polished desks, people moving quickly, eyes focused on their own priorities, unaware that she carried something invisible but significant. She reached the elevator, pressing the button and waiting, her reflection faint in the metal doors, her shoulders no longer tense, her breathing even when the doors opened. She stepped inside alone, the soft hum beginning as it carried her downward, floor by floor, the numbers lighting up one at a time. She let her hand rest lightly against the rail, steadying herself not from fear but from the quiet realization that her life had just shifted in a direction she had not planned for, and yet it did not feel unfamiliar, it felt earned. When the elevator doors opened again, she stepped into the lobby, the scent of polished stone and fresh air greeting her as she crossed the space toward the exit. Outside, the city greeted her with movement, cars passing, people walking, the late afternoon light warming the sidewalk. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder and began walking toward the bus stop, the same route she had taken every day. Nothing about the street had changed, but something about the way she moved through it had. She stood at the corner waiting for the light to change. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from her babysitter simply saying everything was fine. Your daughter finished her homework and is asking when you will be home. Clara felt something soften in her chest, not relief exactly, more like alignment, like the two parts of her world, the one in the glass tower and the one in a small apartment across town, had just been connected in a way that made sense. She typed back quickly, I am on my way, tell her I will be there soon. The light changed, and she crossed the street, blending into the flow of people, just another figure moving through the city but carrying something no one else could see. Far above in the quiet conference room, Alexander Hayes remained where he was standing, his gaze resting on the empty space Clara had occupied moments before. The untouched money still sitting on the table, no longer an offer, no longer a test, just paper. He walked over slowly, picking it up and holding it for a second before setting it aside without thought. His reflection faint in the glass as he looked out over the city again, but this time he was not seeing numbers or deals or timelines. He was seeing something quieter, something he had almost forgotten how to recognize. The cost of a decision was not always measured in dollars, sometimes it was measured in whether you could still recognize yourself when the day was over. And for the first time in a long time, that calculation did not feel as simple as it used to. The bus ride felt longer than usual, not because the route had changed but because Clara was no longer counting the stops the way she used to. Each block passing outside the window blurred into the next, city lights flickering on as the sky deepened into a quiet shade of blue. She sat near the back, her bag resting on her lap, one hand lightly gripping the strap as if grounding herself in something familiar. The low hum of the engine filled the space around her, along with the quiet conversations of strangers, none of them aware that she was replaying a single moment over and over. Not the offer, not the money, but the way her answer had felt when it left her lips, steady, unshaken, like it had been waiting for that moment long before the question was ever asked. Her phone rested in her other hand, the message from earlier still open. She imagined her daughter sitting at the small kitchen table, legs swinging slightly as she colored or traced letters carefully, the way she always did, determined to get them right. Clara exhaled softly, her chest easing as the image settled in her mind. When the bus finally slowed to her stop, she stood, pressing the stop button gently and stepping down onto the sidewalk, the air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of evening traffic and distant food carts. She walked the familiar path, past the same storefronts, the same cracked pavement, the same flickering streetlight that always buzzed just a little too loudly. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly different, not bigger, not easier, just clearer. Her apartment building came into view, modest, worn but steady, the kind a place that held stories quietly without announcing them. She climbed the stairs, her steps automatic, until she reached the door, her hand pausing briefly on the handle, not from hesitation but from the awareness that whatever had happened that day, it did not stay in the glass tower. It followed her here in ways she could not fully name. She opened the door and stepped inside, the warm light of the living room wrapping around her instantly, the soft sound of a television playing low in the background. And then small footsteps, quick and light. Mom, her daughter's voice cut through everything else, bright and certain. Clara barely had time to set her bag down before a small pair of arms wrapped around her waist. She knelt, instinctively pulling her daughter close, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of shampoo and home. Hey sweetheart, she whispered, her voice softer now, warmer in a way it had not been all day. Her daughter pulled back slightly, looking up at her with wide eyes full of curiosity and trust. Did you help people make important decisions today? She asked, the question simple but carrying more weight than she could possibly understand. Clara smiled faintly, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to reflect something real. I think I did, she answered honestly, her hand brushing a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. The little girl nodded, as if that confirmed everything she needed to know, before grabbing Clara's hand and pulling her toward the table. I did my homework and I waited for you to check it, she said proudly. Clara allowed herself to be led, sitting down beside her as papers were spread out in front of her, numbers, letters, small drawings, all done with careful effort. She leaned in, reviewing each line, each answer, her voice gentle as she offered small corrections, small praises, the kind that built something invisible but lasting. As she listened and responded, she realized something quietly, that the decision she had made earlier had not ended in that room. It continued here, in the way she spoke, in the way she showed up, in the way she remained someone her daughter could believe without question. Later that night, after Dinner dishes were washed and small routines completed. Clara stood by the window for a moment, the city stretching beyond her view, not the skyline she had seen earlier but a different version of it, closer, quieter. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, not thinking about titles or contracts or what tomorrow might bring, but about the simple truth that had guided her through the day, that some things did not belong to circumstances, they belonged to you. And somewhere across the city, in a building of glass and steel, Alexander Hayes stood in his office long after the lights had dimmed around him, a file open in front of him, but unread, his thoughts not on projections or numbers but on a quiet voice that had refused to change when it would have been easy to do so. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself questioning not what decisions would bring the most gain, but which ones would allow him to walk out of his own day unchanged in the ways that actually mattered. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency but with the soft rhythm of routine, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, casting pale lines across the small kitchen table where Clara stood pouring coffee into a chipped mug, the scent warm and grounding. Her daughter sat nearby, swinging her legs under the chair, humming softly as she traced letters across a worksheet, her small voice occasionally sounding out words with careful determination. Clara watched her for a moment longer than usual, the simple scene settling into her like something she needed to remember before the world outside asked her to move faster, to decide quicker, to become someone sharper than she wanted to be. "You are going to be late," her daughter said suddenly without looking up, a small smile forming as if she already knew the answer. Clara let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "I will not," she replied, reaching for her bag, but her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she was choosing each step instead of rushing through them. She knelt briefly, adjusting her daughter's sweater, smoothing it down before brushing her fingers lightly against her cheek. "Be good for Mrs. Thompson," she added. Her daughter nodded seriously, then leaned forward, wrapping her arms around Clara in a quick, tight hug. "I always am," she said. Clara held her for just a second longer before standing again, stepping toward the door, the morning air outside cooler than she expected, carrying the low hum of traffic and distant conversations. The walk to the bus felt the same as every other day, the same cracked sidewalk, the same corner store owner setting out crates, the same bus pulling up with a familiar hiss of brakes. But when she stepped inside, something felt different, not in the space around her but in the way she occupied it. She no longer felt like she was passing through unnoticed, she felt present, as if her place in the day had shifted in a way that did not need to be announced. When she reached the office building, the glass reflected the sky clearly, bright and sharp. She paused for a brief moment at the entrance, not out of hesitation but recognition. Yesterday she had walked in hoping to stay. Today she walked in knowing she belonged. The lobby buzzed with movement, people moving quickly, conversations overlapping, the quiet hum of a place already in motion. Clara moved through it steadily, her steps, even her gaze forward. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside, joining a small group of employees, none of them speaking, all of them focused on their own thoughts. The numbers lit up one by one as they ascended, and when the doors opened again on her floor, she stepped out into a space that felt both familiar and slightly altered, like returning to a place that had shifted while you were gone. Whispers traveled quickly, not loud, not obvious, but present. A glance here, a pause there, people who had been in the meeting or had heard about it through someone else, their curiosity subtle but unmistakable. Clara felt it but did not react. She had learned long ago that attention could be loud even when no one said a word. She reached her desk, placing her bag down and organizing her papers with quiet precision, the same way she always did, the same small routine that kept everything steady. A few minutes passed before a voice broke through the low hum of the office. Clara, she looked up to see a member of the executive team standing a few feet away, his posture composed but his expression different than it had been the day before, less certain, less dismissive. "Mr. Hayes would like to see you in his office," he said. Clara nodded once, rising from her chair without hesitation, her steps measured as she followed the hallway toward the far end where glass walls framed a space that overlooked the city. The door was already slightly open, as if expecting her. She knocked lightly anyway before stepping inside. Alexander Hayes stood near the window, his back partially turned, the morning light outlining his figure in a way that softened the edges that had seemed so sharp before he turned as she entered, his expression calm but focused. "You came in early," he said. Clara gave a small nod. "I had things to do," she replied simply. Alexander studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said, not as a command but as an invitation. Clara sat, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap, waiting not with tension but with quiet readiness. Alexander remained standing for a second longer, as if choosing his next words carefully, then he moved toward the desk, placing a thin folder in front of her, not pushing it forward, just setting it there between them. "There is something else I need you to do," he said, his tone steady but carrying a different weight than before. Not a test, not a trap, something else. Clara's eyes moved briefly to the folder, then back to him. What is it, she asked, and for the first time since the day before the answer did not come. Immediately Alexander's gaze held hers, not with uncertainty but with intention, as if this next decision mattered in a way neither of them had expected yet. Alexander did not reach for the folder immediately. Instead, he let the moment settle the same way Clara had done the day before, when silence carried more meaning than words. The morning light stretched across the desk, catching the edge of the paper as if drawing attention to it without force. It is a review, he said finally, his voice calm but deliberate, not of numbers, not of projections, but of decisions that have already been made. Clara's gaze moved down to the folder again, this time noticing the small handwritten note at the corner, a detail that did not belong in a place where everything was usually typed and polished. She did not open it yet, her hands remaining still in her lap. What kind of decisions? She asked. Alexander stepped closer, resting one hand lightly against the desk. Not leaning, just present. The kind that do not show up on reports, he replied. The kind that are justified because they work. Clara lifted her eyes back to him, understanding forming quietly. And you want me to look at them, she said. He nodded once. I want you to tell me if they should have been made at all. The request settled between them, heavier than the one from the day before, not because it involved money but because it involved truth. Clara let out a slow breath, her fingers finally moving as she pulled the folder slightly closer, opening it with careful precision. Inside were pages of summaries, brief notes, decisions signed off months ago, small changes to contracts, adjustments to timelines, approvals that made sense when viewed individually but together formed a pattern, one that felt too familiar. She scanned the first page, then the second, her expression unchanged but her focus deepening. Alexander watched her, not interrupting, not guiding, simply observing the way she read, the way she paused on certain lines, the way her eyes lingered when something did not sit right. Why me? She asked after a moment without looking up. Alexander answered without hesitation, because you are the only person who said no when it was easier to say yes. Clara turned a page slowly, her mind moving through the details, each line carrying its own justification, its own logic, and yet something beneath it all felt off, not wrong in a way that would be flagged immediately but wrong in a way that accumulated over time. These were all approved, she said quietly. Alexander nodded yes. Clara closed the folder gently, her hands resting on top of it now as she considered her words. She did not rush the answer, she did not soften it either. Then they were allowed, she said. The distinction was subtle but precise. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. And that matters? He asked. Clara met his eyes directly. It changes who is responsible, she replied. The air shifted again, not tense, not confrontational but focused. Alexander stepped around the desk, taking the seat across from her, this time lowering himself into it as if placing them on equal ground. If you had been here, he said, would you have approved them? Clara did not answer immediately. She opened the folder again, turning back to the first page, reading one line more carefully than before, her fingers tracing the margin lightly before she looked up. Some of them, she admitted, but not like this. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing. Explain. Clara tapped the page gently. These decisions are not wrong because they exist, she said. They are wrong because no one questioned them once they did. Her voice remained steady, not accusatory, just clear. When something works, people stop asking if it should. The words landed with a quiet finality. Alexander sat back, absorbing that, his expression thoughtful, not defensive, as if the idea was not new but had never been said aloud in a way that made it unavoidable. And you would question them, he said. Clara closed the folder again, this time more firmly. I already am, she replied. The simplicity of the answer left no room for interpretation, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The city beyond the glass continuing its steady motion, unaware that inside a decision of a different kind was being made, one that would not be recorded in numbers or reports but would shape everything that followed. And in that quiet space Alexander Hayes realized that what he had asked for was not just an opinion, it was accountability, and Clara Bennett had just accepted it without asking what it would cost. The rest of the morning moved differently, not slower, not quieter, but sharper, as if every decision carried a weight that had been invisible before. Clara returned to her desk with the folder still in her hands, the thin stack of pages feeling heavier than it should have. She set it down, carefully aligning it with the edge of her workspace, the same precise motion she always used, but this time there was intention behind it, not habit. A few coworkers glanced in her direction, quickly looking away when their eyes met hers. The shift in attention, subtle but undeniable, word had traveled, not about what had happened exactly but enough to change the way she was seen. She did not respond to it, she simply opened the folder again, her focus narrowing as she began reading from the beginning, this time slower, each line examined not just for what it said but for what it avoided. Small Approvals, adjustments, extensions, decisions that looked reasonable when isolated but formed a pattern when placed side by side, a pattern of convenience, of efficiency chosen over clarity. She marked a page lightly with a pen, pausing as a voice broke through her concentration. You are actually going through those? Clara looked up to see the same executive from the day before standing near her desk, his tone neutral but carrying an edge of disbelief. Yes, she replied simply. He glanced at the folder, then back at her, lowering his voice slightly. Those have already been approved by people who know what they are doing. Clara held his gaze steady, not defensive, not dismissive. That does not mean they should not be reviewed, she said. The man let out a short breath, something between a sigh and a restrained reaction. You are new here, he said. There are processes for a reason. Clara nodded, once acknowledging the statement without yielding to it. And processes still depend on people, she answered. The exchange ended there, not because it was resolved, but because neither of them had anything more to add. The man walked away, his expression unreadable. Clara returned to the folder, turning another page, her attention steady, but something inside her more aware now, not just of the content but of the resistance that would follow. She continued working through the morning, marking lines, making notes, not dramatic changes, not sweeping judgments, just precise observations where something did not align, where a decision had been made without a question being asked, where a shortcut had quietly become standard. Time passed without her noticing until a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to see an assistant from Alexander's office holding a small envelope. This is for you, the assistant said, placing it gently beside the folder before stepping away. Clara stared at it for a moment, the paper plain, unmarked, no name, no label, just weight. She reached for it, slowly opening it with careful hands. Inside was a single card, her name written in clean, deliberate handwriting. Clara Bennett, nothing else, no instructions, no explanation, just her name. She turned the card over, blank, her eyes narrowing slightly. Not in confusion but in thought. It was not a message, it was a recognition, not of what she had done but of who she had chosen to be. She placed the card beside the folder, her fingers resting lightly against it before returning to the pages in front of her. Across the office, the same executive who had spoken to her earlier watched from a distance, his expression tightening as he observed the quiet persistence of her work, not loud, not confrontational but undeniable, a disruption not of rules but of assumptions. And in the office at the end of the hall, Alexander Hayes stood near the window again, his gaze moving between the city and the floor below where Clara sat working. He did not interrupt, he did not call her back, and he simply watched the way she moved through something that had been invisible to everyone else until now, and for the first time in years he understood that change would not come from rewriting policies or restructuring teams. It would come from a single question asked at the right moment by someone who refused to let the answer be easy. By midday the rhythm of the office had shifted in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Conversations lowered when Clara passed, not out of respect but out of uncertainty, the kind that followed when something familiar no longer behaved the way it was expected to. She remained at her desk, the folder now marked with small precise notes, pages slightly out of their original order, as she reorganized them into a pattern that made more sense not to the system but to the truth behind it. Her pen moved steadily, not rushed, not hesitant, each mark intentional, as if she understood that even the smallest correction could ripple further than anyone anticipated. A shadow crossed her desk again, but this time it was not the same executive, it was a different one, older, more composed, his expression neutral in a way that suggested experience rather than dismissal. You are making quite an impression, he said quietly. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze without reacting to the tone. I am doing what I was asked to do, she replied. He nodded, once glancing briefly at the folder. Be careful, he added, not as a warning but as an observation. People do not usually appreciate being questioned, especially when they have not questioned themselves in a long time. Clara considered that for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the paper. Then maybe it is time they do, she said simply. The man studied her for a second longer, then gave a faint nod before walking away, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that something had begun. Clara returned to the pages in front of her, turning to a section she had flagged earlier, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced a sequence of approvals, the same names appearing repeatedly, the same justifications reused with minor changes, the pattern clearer now, not accidental, not isolated but sustained. She circled a line lightly, then wrote a single word in the margin, unnecessary. She paused after writing it, her pen hovering for a second before she added another word, accepted. The two words sat beside each other, simple but loaded. She leaned back slightly, exhaling as the realization settled deeper. This was not about one decision, it was about how easily one became many when no one chose to stop them. Her phone buzzed softly, breaking her focus. She glanced at the screen, a message from her Babysitter again. Your daughter asked if you can come early today. There is a school event. Clara's expression softened almost immediately, the tension of the office falling away for a moment as something more important stepped forward. She typed back, I will try to be there on time, then set the phone down, her eyes returning to the folder but her perspective shifting slightly, not divided but clarified. She was not just reviewing decisions, she was deciding what kind of person she would continue to be in a place that had not required it before. Across the office the earlier executive watched again, this time less openly, his attention sharp as he noticed the way others began to adjust small things. A second glance at a document, a pause before signing something, a quiet hesitation. That had not existed before. It was not rebellion, it was awareness. And it unsettled him more than resistance ever would. In his office Alexander Hayes sat at his desk, the same file open in front of him but now filled with Clara's notes, the margins no longer empty, the silence in the room different from before, not hollow but active, as if something was moving beneath the surface. He read one of her comments again. Unnecessary. Then the one beside it, accepted, his fingers tapping lightly against the page, not in impatience but in thought. He had seen reports for years, seen numbers rise and fall, decisions justified, outcomes explained, but this was the first time someone had shown him the space between those lines, the place where choices were made without being seen. He closed the folder, slowly standing and walking toward the window. The city stretched out below, constant and indifferent, but for the first time in a long time he was not looking at it as something to control or measure. He was looking at it as something shaped by thousands of small decisions, most of them unnoticed, and he understood then that what Clara Bennett had started was not a correction, it was a shift, not in policy, not in structure, but in expectation, and once that changed, nothing else could remain exactly the same. By late afternoon the office no longer felt the same, not to Clara and not to anyone else, though most could not explain why. It was in the pauses that appeared where there had been none before, in the extra seconds someone took before signing a document, in the way conversations shifted from certainty to quiet reconsideration. Clara remained at her desk, the folder now nearly complete, her notes precise but unintrusive. She was not rewriting anything, she was revealing what had already been there, the patterns, the assumptions, the decisions that had been made without being seen. She turned the final page slowly, her pen hovering for a moment before she added one last note, not a correction, not a directive, just a question written in small steady handwriting. Should this have been different? She closed the folder gently, her fingers resting on top of it as she exhaled, not from exhaustion but from completion. Across the office the earlier executive approached again, this time without hesitation, his expression controlled but no longer dismissive. You are finished, he said. Clara nodded once. Yes, she replied. He glanced at the folder, then back at her, his voice lowering slightly. Do you understand what happens next? Clara met his gaze calmly. It will be reviewed, she said. He gave a faint shake of his head. It will be challenged, he corrected. People will not agree with you, not because you are wrong but because you are inconvenient. Clara considered that, her expression unchanged. Then they will have to decide why that matters, she answered. The man studied her for a long moment as if weighing something unspoken, then stepped aside without another word, not blocking her path, not guiding it, just acknowledging that whatever came next would not be simple. Clara stood gathering the folder and the small card with her name written on it, placing both carefully into her hands before walking toward the far office. The hallway felt longer this time, not because of distance but because of what it carried, each step deliberate, not hesitant. When she reached the door she knocked lightly, then entered. Alexander Hayes stood behind his desk, the light outside beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the room. He turned as she stepped in, his gaze moving immediately to the folder in her hands. You are done, he said. Clara nodded once, stepping forward and placing the folder on the desk between them. Yes, she replied. Alexander did not open it right away. Instead he looked at her as if measuring something that was no longer about the work itself, and he prompted. Clara held his gaze, her voice steady. Some of the decisions make sense individually, she said, but together they show a pattern of avoiding questions, not answering them. Alexander's expression did not change but his attention sharpened. And that pattern leads where? He asked. Clara did not look at the folder, she kept her eyes on him. To a place where the outcome matters more than how you got there, she said. The words settled into the room quietly but with weight. Alexander reached for the folder, then opening it slowly, his eyes moving over the notes, the margins no longer empty, the questions no longer unspoken. He paused on the final page, reading the single line she had written, his fingers resting lightly against the paper as if holding it in place. Should this have been different? He repeated the question silently before looking up at her. And your answer? He asked. Clara did not hesitate. Yes, she said simply. The clarity of it left no room for negotiation, no space for interpretation, just truth. Alexander closed the folder gently, his gaze lingering on it for a moment before shifting back to her. Then we change it, He said the decision was quiet, not announced, not dramatic, but final. Clara did not react outwardly, she simply nodded once, accepting it the same way she had accepted everything else, not as victory, not as validation, but as responsibility. Alexander stepped around the desk, stopping closer this time, not distant, not elevated, but level. This will not be easy, he added. Clara's expression remained steady. It was not supposed to be, she replied. The room fell silent again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was not tension. It was alignment, two people standing at the edge of a decision that would extend far beyond them, and for the first time since this began it was clear that what had started as a test had become something else entirely, not about proving who she was but about redefining what he was willing to accept. The decision did not echo through the building with announcements or emails. It moved quietly, at first carried in instructions that sounded routine, meetings that appeared on calendars without explanation, documents that were returned for revision without clear reasoning. But the shift was there, and it spread not like disruption but like awareness. Clara felt it in the way her desk no longer felt like a temporary place but a position with weight. Her name spoken differently, not louder but with pause, as if people were adjusting to what it represented. She continued her work, not changing her pace, not seeking attention. The folder now gone from her hands but present in everything that followed. Each document she reviewed, each conversation she entered carried the same question beneath it, not what works but what should. Alexander Hayes moved through the day with a different rhythm as well. Meetings that once followed predictable patterns now paused in places where they had never paused before. His questions shorter but sharper, less about outcomes, more about reasoning. Executives who had once answered quickly now hesitated, not because they lacked answers but because they were no longer certain those answers would be enough. In one meeting a proposal was presented, clean, efficient, supported by numbers that aligned perfectly with expectations. Alexander listened without interruption, his expression neutral until the final slide appeared and the room fell into its usual expectant silence. He glanced briefly at the document, then back at the person presenting. What did we choose not to question here? He asked. The room stilled, the words unfamiliar in that space. The presenter blinked, caught between confidence and uncertainty. Nothing significant, he replied carefully. Alexander did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle the same way Clara had the day before, allowing the weight of the question to exist without rushing to fill it. Then we should look again, he said simply. The meeting did not end abruptly. It shifted. The proposal revisited, lines re-examined, assumptions no longer accepted without thought, and across the table something changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that it could not be undone. Clara heard about the meeting not through direct report but through the quiet conversations that followed. The way people described it in fragments, a question that redirected everything, a pause that felt longer than it should have. She did not react, she did not claim it, she simply continued her work, the same steady rhythm, the same measured approach. Later that afternoon her phone buzzed again, a reminder from the school event she had promised to attend. She glanced at the time, then at the stack of papers on her desk, calculating quickly not what could be finished but what mattered. She stood gathering her things, her movements calm, not rushed. When she reached the hallway she paused briefly outside Alexander's office, the door slightly open. She knocked lightly before stepping inside. He looked up immediately as if expecting her. I need to leave early, she said, her tone respectful but firm. My daughter has an event at school. Alexander did not hesitate. Then you should go, he replied. Clara nodded once, then added, I will finish the rest tomorrow. He shook his head slightly. It will still be there, he said. The simplicity of it carried something unspoken. Clara held his gaze for a moment, then nodded again before turning to leave. As she walked through the office toward the elevator the same eyes followed her, but the feeling was different now, not curiosity, not doubt, something closer to recognition. When she stepped outside the building, the evening light softer than the day before, the city moving at its usual pace. She did not rush, she walked steadily toward where she needed to be, carrying with her not the weight of what had changed but the certainty that it had and that it would continue in ways she did not need to control, only to remain consistent with. Somewhere above, in a room of glass and steel, Alexander Hayes stood again at the window, the city stretching out before him, but his focus no longer on its scale or its movement but on the quiet truth that had begun to reshape it from within, not through force, not through command, but through a question that refused to be ignored and a voice that had chosen not to change even when everything around it expected it to. The school gym was louder than Clara expected, the sound of children's voices echoing off high ceilings, folding chairs scraping lightly against polished floors. Parents gathered in small clusters, their conversations overlapping in a way that felt warm rather than overwhelming. She stood near the entrance for a moment, scanning the room until a small hand waved eagerly from Across the space her daughter's face lit up the moment their eyes met. That same certainty that had guided Clara through the past few days now reflected back at her without question. She walked over, weaving through the crowd, her steps unhurried, her shoulders relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with the day she had left behind. "You made it," her daughter said, breathless with excitement as she grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward a row of chairs. "I told my teacher you would come." Clara sat beside her, brushing her fingers lightly against her hair. "I would not miss it," she replied softly, and she meant it not as a promise kept but as something deeper, something aligned. The event itself was simple: children reading short stories, showing, drawing, small achievements that mattered in ways no report ever could. Clara listened fully, not distracted, not calculating time or tasks, her attention present in a way that felt rare and necessary. When her daughter stood at the front of the room holding a piece of paper with both hands, her voice a little uncertain at first, Clara felt her chest tighten, not with worry but with recognition of courage in its smallest form. "My mom works in a tall building," her daughter began, her eyes scanning the room until they found Clara again. "She helps people make important decisions, and she always tells the truth, even when it is hard." The words landed gently, but they carried more weight than anything Clara had heard all week. She did not move, she did not react outwardly, but something inside her settled into place with quiet certainty, the kind that did not need acknowledgement because it already knew what it was. When the event ended and the room slowly emptied, her daughter slipped her hand into Clara's again. "Did I do good?" she asked. Clara knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes fully. "You did more than good," she said, her voice steady and warm. "You were honest." Her daughter smiled as if that answer was enough, as if it explained everything, and in that moment it did. Clara stood taking her hand as they walked out into the evening, the sky dimming into soft shades of blue and gold, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet rhythm of the city winding down. Somewhere far above the glass tower still stood the same building, the same structure, the same walls, but inside something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. Alexander Hayes remained in his office long after the last meeting had ended, the folder resting closed on his desk, not forgotten, not ignored, but understood. He looked out over the city not as something to control but as something shaped by choices, small quiet decisions made every day by people who either questioned or accepted what was placed in front of them. And he knew now that the difference between those two paths was not measured in profit or loss but in something far more lasting, the ability to recognize yourself at the end of it all. Clara walked beside her daughter down the sidewalk, their pace unhurried, their conversation light and simple, the kind that filled space without needing to impress or explain. And for the first time in a long time she felt no separation between the person she was at work and the person she was at home. There was no line to manage, no version to maintain, just one steady truth carried through both worlds without compromise, because in the end it had never been about the money or the meeting or even the decision itself. It had been about the quiet moment when she chose not to change, and in doing so changed everything. If this story stayed with you even for a moment, if it reminded you of a time when doing the right thing felt small but mattered more than anything else, then maybe that is worth holding on to, and maybe it is worth sharing with someone who needs to remember it too.